Well, hello. My name's Paul Lavasser, and I'm with the Dartmouth Wanderers. I'm going to take you on a rather historic trip here through the town of Dartmouth and beyond to give everybody an idea of what our railroad line here is like. We're coming up to an anniversary here pretty soon at the end of this year, and it's kind of an appropriate time to talk a little about the history of this line and what's developed throughout the years. Well, this line here has a rather unique history. It was actually the first railroad proposed for this area, meaning the whole greater New Bedford area, and it wound up being the last one built. To be a little more specific, the railroad was first proposed back in 1835, and the name that they gave to it was the Fall River Mill Road Company. And it was supposed to run from Fall River's Wharf, where the steamboats took off, over to about where the Parker School is in New Bedford on County Street. That might be a little amusing to some of you that know the area well, because it's in the middle of the city right now. But in those days, it was kind of semi-country. Well, of course, that never happened. And it was instigated by a fellow named Andrew Robeson of New Bedford. Now, Andrew Robeson was a rather interesting fellow, businessman, and what he did was he had his home here in New Bedford, and he had his factory in Fall River. Now, in those days, you had a little bit of a problem getting from one place to the other, because the only way to get there was either by stage or by horseback. And he chose horseback, and on a daily basis pretty near, he went from New Bedford to Fall River. Now, you got to remember something. The highway ended at Smith Mills in those days. Then you had to take Hicksville Road over to Hicksville, then up the old Fall River Road to Fall River at the Narrows, and then into town. So it presented quite a problem, especially in poor weather. Well, Robeson decided, well, railroads were coming into their own at this time. Let's see if we can get a railroad going. So anyway, the line was started. Yeah, that is, the survey was started. And it's much the way the railroad is today, actually. But the situation was that they decided they were going to use strap rail, and the train was going to be hauled by locomotive of the period. I'll show you a picture of that pretty soon, actually. And the type of rail they were going to use was called strap rail. Well, here's a piece of strap rail. This is what it looks like. You had a beam made of wood. On top, you had strap iron. And, of course, you've got to remember the trains in those days, they didn't go very fast. But just the same, wooden rails was not the most appropriate thing, but it was what they had. If indeed the Fall River Railroad had been built in the mid-1830s, it would probably have had rolling stock something like this train, the locomotive of which some folks jokingly called a cook stove on wheels. Actually, this is a scene of the opening of the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad in 1831. The locomotive's name was DeWitt Clinton. Passenger cars were actually stagecoach bodies fitted with flanged iron wheels. This close-up view of the DeWitt Clinton will give you a good idea of what the strapped iron rails looked like. Note the wooden beams and stone sleepers below the locomotive. Well, different things happened. The railroad, for some reason, was not built at the time. Then there was another survey, and you had a survey in 1837, and that survey said that the line was going to go about where it still is today, like the first one. But then in 1847, something interesting happened. And they had what they called the Ingalls Survey. Now, this survey said that the line was to go actually south of Smith Mills, and between Smith Mills and Russell's Mills, actually, then go south of South Watuppa Pond, connecting in with the railroad in Fall River, somewhere around the steamboat wharf. Well, this Ingalls survey also never took off. Then there was a survey in 1864. Well, that one too, nothing happened because there was a recession at the end of the Civil War, and they just didn't have the money. After that, there was a general agitation for a railroad. Finally, everybody got together and said, well, something's got to be done here. So they broke themselves into two groups. There was a group that favored going through the northerly route that was proposed. Then there was a group that wanted to go through the southerly route, which was the Ingalls survey. And it was really fought quite heavily, mainly in the city of New Bedford, between the two groups. Finally, the northern group finally got what they wanted, and the line was built as we see here. However, it was built with very small rail, what's called 50-pound rail. Here's a sliver here, and what I want to do is let's go and take a look at how this compares with the rail of today. Here we are, a switch here at Hicksville Road, and I'll just put this piece beside to give you an idea of the relative side of today's rail as against what was originally used on the line. A lot different. Now, when we say 50-pound rail, that means it's 50 pounds in length for a yard's of length. So every yard would be 50 pounds. And this rail that is in service today is certainly much greater than that.
This is where it all began, Pearl Street Depot No. 1 in New Bedford. It was a strange building designed in the Egyptian style. Constructed in 1840, it served the railroad until 1886. The Watuppa branch began here with its own track on the left side of the station. The Old Colony Railroad built this fine brick depot in 1886 to replace the old station that we just saw a block or so away. It served the branch until the end of service to Fall River. This structure survived until March of 1973, when it was demolished by urban renewal. Here we see the Watuppa branch section of the Old Colony Railroad public timetable effective November the 9th, 1891. Notice that there are 5 passenger trains each way, weekdays only. Also, the stations at Hicksville, Westport Factory, and Hemlock were flag stops, as shown by the tiny letter D after the times listed. This meant that passenger trains stopped only when signaled to do so. No passenger trains ran on weekends. Here's a station few people know about on the New Bedford-Taunton main line. It's Wells Street Depot, during that time period before the tracks were elevated, a project begun in 1907. This scene is looking easterly toward Wells Square itself. This station, though, was not actually a scheduled stop on the Fall River timetable. With the elevation of track, completed in 1908, the railroad erected this shelter to take the place of the old Wells Street Depot. Notice the bike, kerosene station platform light, and Wells Street trolley car barn in the background. Watuppa trains usually passed right by this spot.
Where we are now is on the New Bedford-Taunton main line. This was the original line that was put in 1840, and now it's back down to a single line. But back when the Watuppa branch was built, we had double tracks here, and then the Watuppa branch actually came off its own track, off to the side. If we turn and look this way, there was a third track that went around, and it came on its own all the way from Pearl Street Station. It didn't need a switch in those original days back in 1875. However, the line here has been changed a number of times over the years, and what was double track at one time is now back to single track again, and as a result, the switch had to be put in over on this end and also on the north end of the main line here between New Bedford and Taunton. This forms a Y-shaped situation, and it's good in a way because it allows locomotives and cars to be turned around easily here at this end of the line. Well, Here we are on the north end of the Watuppa Y here in New Bedford on the New Bedford-Taunton main line. And what you're seeing here is the way the track curves off to the right. This is the part that's used mostly today. However, it's important to note that it's actually the last part of the Y track that was put in back just around the turn of the century. It is not part of the original railroad at all, because the original one just came in from New Bedford from Pearl Street Depot and went west over to Fall River. This part here was added as a convenience later on, and it's changed quite a bit since the old days, because the double track main line that was here, of course, has been made single, as I told you before, and all this switch affair has been moved over the years. This scene we've got here is looking as the Watuppa branch tracks curve around Purchase Street in New Bedford, and it looks like they go into weeds, but they don't actually. It's just that they're on both sides. And it's going to come to the first crossing, which is Mount Pleasant Street, which we'll see shortly, actually.
Taking a look at this map from the Atlas of Bristol County for 1895 will familiarize you with all of the stations on the Fall River Railroad. Other than New Bedford's main depot and that at Weld Street, those stops on the branch started at Mount Pleasant, then North Dartmouth, Hicksville, Westport Factory, Hemlock, North Westport, Flint Village, and finally Watuppa in Fall River. We'll visit each of these places one by one. In addition, we'll show you some film clips of trains on the branch back in 1979, just for a little extra flavor.
Here we are at Mount Pleasant Crossing. This is actually the first crossing once coming off the switch in New Bedford. And as you can see from the traffic, it's a very busy place. At one time, this used to be a crossing gate shanty on this side, and a crossing tender took care of the traffic. Now, as you can see, there's flashers, and that just does the job. Also, the important thing here for us is this site right here, because this is the site of the first station once you've left New Bedford on this branch. It was called Mount Pleasant Station, and we'll take a look at that shortly. It lasted into the 20s, and then it disappeared like so many of the rest of them. But it was replaced by the crossing shanty that controlled the traffic of the street when the train came, because the trains really didn't stop in those days. They just kept going right through, and you had to have a crossing tender to flag the crossing for the train.
Mount Pleasant Station, first stop on the line, was situated here on the northwest corner of the Mount Pleasant Street crossing. Its Victorian architectural style is also mirrored in those stations at North Dartmouth and North Westport. Note the train signal above the front door. Here we are close to what was the Continental Screw Company, now Building 19.
Well, here we are now just west of Mount Pleasant Station, which is behind me over here, and we've come up to Shawmut Avenue crossing. Now, normally there's no real significance to this crossing, except that back in the 1950s, there was a very interesting industry over on the side here where the junkyard is today. And I believe the industry had to do with tar making. But I was only a kid at the time and used to ride my bicycle up here for a rather special purpose. You see, the company needed hot steam for their work. And as a result, they bought a locomotive, a steam locomotive from the New Haven Railroad, because of course they were being phased out at the time in favor of diesel. And they parked it over on the side over here, attached a long chimney to the smokestack, and proceeded to use it for getting up steam for whatever their work was. Well, I used to come over to see the steam locomotive because there weren't many of those things left around here in New England at the time, and especially on the New Haven. The company painted the locomotive shiny aluminum color and then proceeded to use it for a number of years. Well, all of a sudden one day I rode my bicycle up here, and what happened was there was no locomotive left. The only thing I found was the top of the cab roof, and the top of the cab roof was right over near the crossing over here, and I remember walking on it at the time and being very unhappy because the locomotive was no longer there. It's just one of the little stories here along the Watuppa branch that isn't quite railroading, but is still part of the history of the line, I guess. Now, if we take a look on this side, we have two sidings at this point, one going into the bottled gas company here, and the other over to Agway. Both of these at this time are out of service. And now, if we train the camera down track, there's a little interesting sight here because the tracks go downhill and then skirt up over into Dartmouth itself. Now, over on the area where it's very low, apparently from what the old timers tell me around here, there used to be a hobo camp back in the 1920s and 30s. And well, I guess it's believable because there was a lot of freight traffic around here at the time. After that, there's a swampy area, and also the garbage plant for New Bedford is over on this side and used to have a siding at one time back much earlier in the century. Then we come up to Faunce Corner Road in Dartmouth, and that's where we're going to join the situation shortly. Here we are at Faunce Corner Road crossing. Now, Faunce Corner Road used to be called in the late 1800s the Old South Road, and then changed name later on. What we're looking at here is the Faunce Corner Road crossing. Now, a lot of people think that there used to be a station here because it's so busy today. But back in the 1800s, this was not a busy crossing at all. The busier one was Hicksville Road itself. So that this was just a road out into the back country where the farms were. That's about it. Now, as we look, though, there's a grade that comes up here, and it's difficult even for trains today to stop for the traffic and then proceed. So that eventually, I imagine they're going to be putting flashers in here, some sort of crossing protection. Here's a part of the Watuppa branch that most people don't get to see and don't know. This is Farmers Crossing between Faunce Corner Road and Hicksville Road, and you can see where the pathway here for the cows goes into the field over on this side. And if we kind of walk this way, we get to the gate, and somewhere up there the cows are still right there. Now, this railroad here also had another nickname. It was sometimes called by some people the Farmers Line or the Farmers Railroad, simply because it went through so much farm country between New Bedford and Fall River. This is a typical example of that type of crossing where the farmers' fields were on both sides of the railroad tracks. Of course, the trains never went terribly fast here and still don't today, but the cows, for the most part, stayed out of the way. Well, here we are right on the corner of Hicksville Road, what used to be called Hicks's Meeting House Road, and the Watuppa Branch Railroad. Now, as we look over in this direction, we're going towards Fall River. This way is towards New Bedford. And the station that was here, which was North Dartmouth Station, was situated right in this spot right here. It doesn't look very attractive right now, but the station was right here, the loading platform here, and it was just a nice, very typical country station.
North Dartmouth Station on the southeast corner of Hicksville Road crossing looks a bit high up in this view from the 1890s. However, this photo was taken long before the land in the foreground was filled in as it is today, and which now gives the area a much flatter look.
Right here is the remains of the siding that went into the bottled gas place here at Hicksville Road. You can see the rotting ties and the rails that belong to the bottled gas company. The railroad took out their section in here and took out the switch down a ways here. And you can see that when something's not used, it goes back to nature, which is really happening right at this spot. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of the siding when it was actually in operation back some years ago.
Here's a clip of the local freight train spotting a car at the bottled gas siding on August the 14th, 1979. This piece of track has now been out of service for some years. This is surely a picture-perfect spot to get train photos, the Shingle Island River Bridge just east of Reed Road in Dartmouth. These views are the locomotive and caboose of a local freight returning from Fall River back in September of 1973. There goes a freight train heading back to New Bedford in 1979. Note the different type of caboose being used by this time.
Right behind me here is the site of Hicksville Station. Now, Hicksville Station used to be right about where between where the rock was and the road right over here, because what we're on here is actually old Reed Road. Before the new part was put in and this became just a dead end. Here it was the busy station for most of this end of Dartmouth and part of Westport, because Westport is just down the tracks a little ways. It's interesting to note here that Hicksville in those days was spelled H-I-C-K-S rather than H-I-X. And the station, though it wasn't big, was an important little country station.
Hicksville Station at Old Reed Road Crossing was no Grand Central, but it well served its purpose. Note the difference in architecture from that of the previous two stations. By the way, for those that might be wondering, we are told that the bicycle belonged to the photographer.
It's at this point on the railroad here at Reed Road, Old Reed Road, where the railroad actually changes. If you remember earlier in the narrative, we talked about the fact that now there are two railroads controlling this one line. CSX Corporation has the eastern end, and right about here is where the Bay Colony Railroad takes over and heads over to Fall River in this direction here. Now, down, if you take a look in this direction here, we have a long double siding. This is for one of the beverage places that's situated here as a business at Reed Road. The other is east of here, just east of here on New Reed Road, which is another beverage place, Colonial Beverage. Here we are at Westport Factory Station off Highland Avenue in Westport, just over the Dartmouth line. This is the only place on the line where you can actually see the remains of one of the stations, Westport Factory Station. And if we look carefully in the brush here, you can see the abutments here. There's another down below over here, and some displaced pieces over on this side here, all part of the station. And actually, of all the stations on the line, this is the only one that has any surviving evidence at all, except at Watupper itself in Fall River. Here at Westport Factory Station, there used to be a rather large cleared area on the west side of the station itself, and there was long siding that came in so that farmers and the people at Westport Factory itself could offload and onload freight. Also, there's one other interesting thing about this line that we might mention here. If you remember, back in the beginning of the film, we talked about the early idea of having a railroad here. And at that time, when the survey was made, there was an part of the survey that said, well, we're going to get 2 locomotives, we're going to get some merchandise cars and some passenger cars. It's the only time actually where this was ever done, because subsequently no rolling stock at all was ever bought at any time on the line. Rather, a rolling stock was rented from the railroad that ran from New Bedford to Taunton and beyond, starting with the New Bedford Railroad, then the Old Colony, the New Haven, and so on, until passenger service ended.
Westport Factory Station was somewhat similar in architecture to that of the station at Hicksville. It was situated just to the west of the railroad bridge on Highland Avenue in Westport. Notice how open this area was back 100 years ago. Today, it is covered with a dense growth of trees and underbrush, as we have just seen. The freight train in this view is beginning to back down track to the right toward Dartmouth. This view of Westport Factory Station was taken some time after it was abandoned, for the windows are boarded over and decay has set in. It would sure be fun to know who the 2 gents are on the platform. It's certainly too late for a passenger train, for the cars stopped running back in 1918. Well, here we are at Hemlock Station on Davis Road in Westport. Locals called the place Hemlock Gutter, perhaps because of the stream that ran in back of the building. The covered structure on the left is a coal bunker for servicing the pot-belly stove inside during the colder months of the year.
Here we are just beyond Hemlock Gutter Station, and actually this is the end of active track here on the Watuppa branch. Behind me you can see Mid-City Scrap and the operation there, and the one locomotive that the Bay Colony Railroad has here on the Watuppa branch. They control this part of the operation down, as you know, as far as the beverage places there at Reed Road. There's a barrier here, and this barrier is here simply for protecting the cars from going onto the road and causing a problem. This was put in recently. This is not something that's been here along the railroad for any length of time, actually.
A closer look at the end of the active track next to Mid-City Scrap reveals a still complete old switch stand, and as we look further down the track, we can see gondola cars on the left being filled with scrap metal, and a Bay Colony Railroad diesel locomotive on the right. Beyond this point, much of the right-of-way has nearly returned to nature. One would hardly know there is a railroad here at Sanford Road Crossing today, for the right-of-way is badly overgrown. Only the tracks in the street remind us of the line. Now, here's a cute, rather romantic view of North Westport Station on Sanford Road in Westport. Notice its similarity of design to those of both North Dartmouth and Mount Pleasant. One might just wonder who the 3 barefoot youngsters are standing on the depot platform. We're approaching the Narrows here near White's Restaurant. As the rails poke out of heavy brush and become clear again, we come to the Route 6 stop sign and the now absent rails in the road which were removed just a year ago. Let's cross over at this point and look back at this scene. Here, on the lake side of Route 6, we can easily see what was the railroad crossing. Now, let's just imagine this same view back in the 70s. This is a little better. Hi, Joe. Running into Fall River was both quite interesting and picturesque. There were old millstones along the lakeside near here, and several areas of high marsh reeds and growth. There were also some industrial sidings, and of course the fill through the Quequechin River. This small depot was situated in the Flint section of Fall River, right near the Quequechin River, and nearby mills, not really very far from the end of the line. The end of the line was Watuppa Station, seen here situated on Plymouth Avenue in Fall River. This structure was not only the line's terminal in the Spindle City, but also housed the company offices. Its design, as one can see, was very different from other stops on the line. This building also outlasted all of the other depots on the branch, for it was not demolished until 1956. A gas station now occupies the site. Note the ends of both a passenger car and Erie Railroad boxcar in this scene from the first decade of the 20th century. Here's another view of Watuppa Station with a well-bedecked vehicle in the foreground fitted out nicely for a parade. The pennants and sign are promoting butter crust bread. Well, here's the mode of transportation that put passenger trains out of business on the Watuppa branch, the trolley car. As early as 1893, a trolley route to Fall River was being surveyed. Through cars began running on July the 1st, 1894. As a result, from 5 passenger trains each way weekdays in 1894, by 1902, service had been cut back to 2 each way. Then, even this was reduced to a mixed freight and passenger train. All passenger service was finally suspended in the fall of 1918. This trolley, built by the Jones Company in 1899, is standing on the Purchase Street side of the Wells Street car barn in New Bedford. It's a bit curious to see that both the railroad tracks and Wells Street station can be seen in the background. Here's a broadside view of the same car. Along the side, under the windows, one can see the words New Bedford and Fall River. The only evidence of this trolley line today is the center island along Route 6 in Dartmouth and Westport, where the double-track right-of-way once ran. In 1910, the New Haven Railroad proposed linking up Fall River's main line along the Taunton River with the Watuppa branch's end of track. This was to be accomplished by boring a tunnel under the city. With this new trackage in place, a more direct route from New York to Cape Cod would be formed using existing steamboat and rail lines. The proposed tunnel can be seen on this map as a dashed line in the lowest center going up to the end of track near the lower Quequechin River. Nothing happened in the end with this proposal, however, due to a change in New Haven management. This map will give you an idea of how the line ended originally in Fall River at 8 Rod Way, now called Plymouth Avenue. This was in 1895 and before the Rodman Street Freight Yard was constructed. Here's a close-up of the end of track. The following are some views of the Rodman Street Yard while still in service back in the 70s, with freight house, crane, cars, and even track are a thing of the past. Only the very end of the freight house survives, the yard being only a fenced-off area of weeds and brush. This end of the line once saw a lot of freight traffic, including appliances, furniture, paper products, textiles, building materials, potatoes, and meat packing, to name just some of the activity. Let's take a look at a current CSX freight train near what was North Dartmouth Station at Hicksville Road. Here comes the freight now. The train's crew is spotting a group of gondola cars on the siding. Later, these cars will be picked up by a Bay Colony locomotive and brought to Mid-City Scrap in Westport. Here's the same train returning from spotting full cars and picking up empties at Reed Road Area Industries. It will continue on to New Bedford and then go north on the main line to Middleborough.
Well, folks, here we are back where the story first began here on the Watuppa branch. And I just wanted to reflect on some last facts for the railroad. It's been around for now 125 years. And going back to the early days of the road, it really was an independent railroad for just some 6 odd years, that's all. It only had one president, Joseph Arthur Bovair of New Bedford. In 1882, the Old Colony took over the line and ran it until 1893 when the New Haven took over. The New Haven controlled it well into the 20th century, and then, as we've seen throughout the movie, the railroad was taken over first by Penn Central, then by Conrail, and then now CSX Corporation controls the line. Also, part of it on the western end was taken over by the Bay Colony, and you've seen the operation with that. It's rather interesting, though, because this line has outlived the Fairhaven branch, which ran for 99 years and then went out of business. It has more business now than the main line into New Bedford, actually. So it's kind of outlived the other two main lines that ran into the port of New Bedford. Well, today there's some mementos of the line still in existence. We've got passes, papers of different kinds, pictures, of course, as you've already seen in some movie clips. There's even a couple of these cat's meow models in a store in Russell's Mills of the two stations here in Dartmouth. Stations are gone now, of course. We don't know exactly what happened to them either. It's possible that they were made into chicken coops or tool sheds or who knows what. It'd be kind of interesting to know if any still exist at all. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this film. A little bit of history here in Dartmouth on, well, what we call a magic carpet made of steel. And on behalf of the Wanderers and Dartmouth Television, I want to thank you for watching. Goodbye.